one thing about Beyond the Gates, it knows exactly how to make grief, guilt, attraction, and hypocrisy sit in the same room together and somehow make all of it feel emotionally believable until one character pushes things just a little too far. And right now, that character is Ted. Because the more I watch this storyline unfold, the more I feel like the writers are deliberately asking us a very uncomfortable question. Can someone genuinely want to be a good man while continuously making selfish emotional choices? And honestly, I think that's the real story here. The surface level drama is obvious. Derek's death has shaken everyone around Garland. Shanice is emotionally collapsing under the weight of grief. Nicole is being pulled into multiple emotional directions at once. Ted is trying to help. Leslie continues to exist like a walking emotional landmine. And somewhere in the middle of all this, Garland's leadership situation is quietly turning into a political war waiting to explode. But beneath all of that chaos, there's a much smarter narrative forming. This isn't just about who loves who. It's about emotional responsibility and who actually understands the consequences of their own behavior. That's why Shanice unexpectedly became the emotional center of this storyline for me. Because let's be honest, when Derek died, most viewers naturally expected Jacob to carry the emotional weight of the aftermath. That's the usual soap structure. The romantic connection gets the spotlight. The family gets the breakdown scenes. The expected mourners become the emotional focus. But Beyond the Gates did something more interesting. They shifted the emotional realism onto Shanice, and it worked. You could feel it during her conversation with Leah. The way she talked about Derek didn't sound performative. It didn't sound like television grief where characters cry beautifully under perfect lighting and then move on 2 episodes later. Shanice sounded exhausted, drained, like someone carrying grief in her body instead of just in her dialogue. That difference matters. Because real grief often shows up in smaller moments, in avoidance, in emotional numbness, in random breakdowns during ordinary conversations, and Shanice has been carrying all of that in a way that feels painfully authentic. Honestly, I think she's hurting even more deeply than Jacob right now. Not louder, not more dramatically, just more truthfully. And this is exactly why Ted stepping into the situation becomes so frustrating to watch. Now, on paper, Ted's intentions sound noble. He notices Shanice is struggling after Derek's death, so he asks Nicole to talk to her and help her emotionally process everything. Fine. That's compassionate. That's mature. That's what emotionally intelligent adults should do. But then the show immediately reminds us why Shanice has been avoiding Ted in the first place. Leslie, always Leslie. And this is where Ted completely loses me. Because I genuinely cannot understand how Ted expects Shanice to feel emotionally safe around him while he continues defending Leslie's behavior. Worse than that, he actually tries to rationalize it by saying Leslie's personality is partly his responsibility. I'm sorry. What? That logic sounds emotionally evolved for about 5 seconds until you actually think about what he's saying. There's a difference between acknowledging your impact on someone's life and continuously enabling toxic behavior because you feel guilty. Ted keeps blurring those lines, and I think the writers know he's doing it. That's why this storyline is working so well. Ted doesn't feel like a villain. He feels like a man addicted to being needed. And those are two very different things. Because look at what he's doing simultaneously. He wants Shanice emotionally. He wants to protect Leslie emotionally. He wants Nicole professionally close to him. And he wants to believe he can balance all of it without consequences. That's not compassion anymore. That's emotional greed. Yes, I said greed. And no, I don't think that's too harsh. Actually, I think the show is practically begging us to see it. Ted keeps positioning himself as the responsible caretaker of everyone else's emotions, but what he's really doing is keeping emotional doors open everywhere he goes. Shanice never gets full reassurance because Leslie still exists in Ted's emotional orbit. Leslie never truly faces accountability because Ted softens the impact of her behavior. And Nicole? Nicole is slowly being pulled into emotional territory she probably knows is dangerous. That's the ticking time bomb nobody is talking about enough. Because Nicole thinking about Ted during intimate moments recently was not random writing. Soap operas don't plant details like that accidentally. That scene was a warning shot. The writers are building emotional momentum between Ted and Nicole very carefully and honestly in a smarter way than I expected. Notice what makes their dynamic dangerous. It's not raw passion. It's emotional understanding. That's worse. Physical attraction burns fast. Emotional intimacy builds slowly and destroys quietly. Ted and Nicole keep drifting into spaces where they understand each other too well, support each other too naturally, and rely on each other too comfortably. And now Ted suggesting Nicole for Garland's chief of staff position? Oh, come on. You cannot tell me the writers don't understand the implications of that. Professionally, the suggestion makes sense. Nicole is capable, composed, strategic. Frankly, compared to Monica, Nicole probably does feel like the more stable leadership choice. But emotionally, this gets messy fast because even if Ted's intentions are completely innocent, which I'm not convinced they are, perception matters, especially in workplaces, especially in hospitals, especially in soap operas where personal relationships always bleed into institutional politics eventually. And this is where Shanice becomes important again. I actually agree with one thing here. Shanice probably would try very hard not to let personal emotions interfere with work. That feels consistent with her character. She's emotional, yes, but she's also grounded enough to separate professionalism from personal pain when necessary. The problem is, humans aren't robots. Even emotionally mature people eventually react when patterns become impossible to ignore. Imagine watching a man who keeps insisting he cares about you continuously orbit another woman emotionally and professionally at the same time. At some point, it stops being about trust and starts being about self-respect. That's why I think Ted is walking into a disaster he doesn't fully recognize yet. And the most fascinating part, he probably thinks he's being honorable. That's the twist I keep coming back to. I don't think Ted sees himself as manipulative. I don't even think he consciously realizes how much emotional space he occupies in multiple women's lives simultaneously. In his mind, he's probably trying to help everyone, protect everyone, support everyone. But intention does not erase impact. That's one of the smartest themes Beyond the Gates has explored lately. Sometimes people cause damage not because they're evil, but because they refuse to make hard emotional choices. Ted wants everyone, not romantically necessarily, emotionally, and eventually that becomes unsustainable. Now let's talk about Garland itself, because I think viewers are underestimating how important this leadership storyline really is. On the surface, it feels like a secondary plot. Who replaces Leah? Nicole or Monica? Standard workplace politics. But I think the writers are using Garland as a structural pressure point for future conflicts. Why? Because hospitals in soap operas are never just hospitals. Their power centers control Garland. And suddenly you influence investigations, patient access, internal secrets, hiring decisions, political alliances, everything. And with the plasma storyline still unresolved, plus the impaler remaining unidentified, leadership at Garland suddenly becomes very suspiciously important timing-wise. That's why I don't think the Nicole versus Monica setup is the final destination. I think it's a distraction. And honestly, the producers may have already hinted at the real twist. The moment I remembered that a new actor is supposedly joining Beyond the Gates, the entire storyline started looking different to me. because introducing a new character right as Garland faces a leadership vacuum feels way too convenient. This is soap opera mathematics. Nothing happens accidentally. A new chief of staff entering the hospital right now would instantly disrupt every existing dynamic. Nicole gets sidelined emotionally. Monica gets challenged professionally. Ted loses influence. Shanice gains distance. And the plasma storyline suddenly has a brand new access point. That last part is especially important because I still don't believe the plasma investigation is truly over. Not even close. The show keeps treating the impaler like a shadow that's temporarily disappeared, not a threat that's actually been eliminated. And whenever a soap does that, it usually means the danger has simply changed shape. So what if the new character isn't just administrative? What if they're connected to plasma somehow? What if Garland's leadership crisis is intentionally opening the door for infiltration? What if the hospital itself is more compromised than anyone realizes? See, that would explain why the show keeps intertwining emotional storylines with institutional politics. It's not random overlap. It's narrative preparation, and suddenly Ted's recommendation of Nicole becomes even more complicated. Because if Garland is about to become the center of a much darker storyline, then leadership decisions stop being symbolic. They become dangerous. Which brings me back to Shanice one last time. Ironically, the person grieving the hardest may end up being the one seeing the clearest. Grief strips illusions away. It changes how people read others. And Shanice already seems emotionally sensitive to contradictions in Ted's behavior. That instinct may become incredibly important later if the story keeps moving toward emotional betrayal and institutional corruption at the same time. And honestly, that's why I'm still invested in the show even when certain choices frustrate me. Because underneath the soap drama, Beyond the Gates occasionally asks surprisingly sharp questions. Can guilt become a form of selfishness? Can emotional loyalty become emotional manipulation? And how many people get hurt when someone refuses to choose a direction? Ted may think he's keeping everyone together, but from where I'm sitting, he looks like the center of a slow emotional collapse that hasn't happened yet.